Welcome to The Second Studio, a design and architecture podcast hosted by two architects, myself, David Lee, and Marina Borderonay.
Oh, my.
Yeah. This week it's just the two of us, and we were talking about architecture and design reviews, critiques, pinups, right?
Right.
To preface this, I want to say that the design review format, architecture review pinup format, right, has been contested of late because of changes in technology, our reliance on Zoom, and also because there have been a lot of negative outcomes from design presentations in schools. Basically because people are just really mean. Critics are really mean at these reviews, right? I think I've said it before on here, but what happened was, this was discussed on the show in the past, and we made an Instagram post saying, like, maybe the review should disappear, quoting a guest that was on this show, right. Saying that it's not working. And immediately we had a number of messages from people, some former listeners, some listeners and former guests, some very high up people in the world saying this is not a good idea. Barack Obama. Oh, he's not the president. But Biden will be the president if he stays alive and healthy until... Anyway. DM'd us on Instagram saying, I don't agree with this because the architecture review, critique, whatever format, is one of the most valuable parts of the education of an architect.
Yeah, and someone even said that's probably the closest you would get as a student to the professional world, which is presenting a project to a potential client.
Yeah, and I agree with that. There is you need to learn as a student. You need to learn how to manage, mediate, moderate, communicate. Right, a whole bunch of weird people that are kind of coming together for a particular moment. Those skill sets are essential for like the rest of your life if you're going to do anything outside of academia. Academics tend to live in their own little world, and they don't realize the things you have to deal with when you're not in the realm of a university, right? And that's not the case for all academics, obviously, but that tends to be true, I would say.
Yeah, and if you want to grow within the office you're part of, or if you want to have your own office, right? If you just want to be a drafter or a designer on your computer and not have to deal with any of that, you probably have the choice to do so. But if you don't want to, that's definitely a skill you have to know.
So I just want to say that because it needs to be said for this recording.
And then there's the whole questioning of, in-person presentation versus digital. We're not going to get into like the differences. The differences, like, no matter what, there will still be some sort of presentation review, right? It's virtual, it's physical, it's with people, it will still happen. It seems for a while. So
yeah, no, there's not many. We did the how to make a presentation, how to give a presentation recordings, and the same thing with this discussion. There's not really any huge differences between digital, remote, stuff versus in person. There are more challenges with doing things remotely, but the principles are the same. And if you get the principles right, you're going to be good in whatever situation. For the students, I think also there's a lot of pressure that we put as a student, right? You put on these reviews because you only have a handful of big ones in your academic career. Certainly with one semester, which is one project, which is like, a project, when you design a project, it's like you've lived a life. There's a beginning, middle, and an end, and there's a kind of a birth and a death, and it really is a chapter of your life. And there's only two significant points in that where things kind of become crystallized or have an opportunity to, which is at the mid-review and the final review. Just to say that there's a lot of pressure, right, on the review to do well at the review, I think it's true that it makes sense that there's that, but I think some students put way too much, they put the review up on a pedestal when in some regard it doesn't need to be.
Well, it's almost like when you are a student and you have those reviews, it's like you're an artist and you're rehearsing for the D-Day performance, the show, right? The big final show. So it's a big deal in that sense, right? Like you're kind of like warming up to the big ending. Mm-hmm. But you are not an artist in the sense that this is not your career. Your career is not to be a student and keep doing those reviews, right? Your career is to graduate from those reviews and move on to the real thing, right, in a way, right? So it's not as important. Those are just baby steps towards something that's actually much bigger than that.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, and it's interesting because the reviews that I've been a part of, first from context, right, either as a teacher, as a critic, or as a student, or I think there's an audience member, I guess is the fourth one. There's usually around 6 guest critics. If someone's late or people have to leave, there's drops down to 2 sometimes, which is not great. And the most I've been a part of was I think 9. It gets kind of that's too many at that point, the whole Q&A or presentation and Q&A process lasts half an hour, something like this, right? So that's what we're dealing with. It's pretty standard. I think that's typical for most institutions, for most schools. Sometimes there's a show setting where there's not feedback given. I'm not talking about that. We're talking about where you get feedback. Those reviews, right, almost become their own thing in a sense because of the politics and the social dynamics between critics. And this is where also I think some educators think well, what's the point of these reviews? Because they just become a show for the drama queens.
And that's why you cannot put too much pressure on those reviews. Because if you, again, think about it as an artistic performance, say a dancing performance, right? You've been rehearsing, you've been working on your part, but you have maybe 5 dancers that you're inviting the day off that you don't know what their skills are, you don't know what they're going to contribute to the event. So to that sense, you can't put pressure on it because you cannot fully control the outcome of the performance.
It's an interesting way to look at it. And it's also to say that being a designer is finding a weird balance between listening to everyone, but also not listening to anybody, right? And you hear these kinds of tropes online, always do you. Only you know what's right. Follow your dreams.
Right.
And, you see this and it's yeah, okay, Quentin Tarantino, whoever's saying this, that works. But guess what? You're Tarantino or you're Taika. That doesn't work for everybody. And when you're a student, you can't afford to have that mindset. And on the inverse is true, too. You can't be listening to everybody. And students tend to want to go to one end or the other. Why? Because it's easy. It's really difficult to listen to everybody, but also listen to no one at the same time. That's difficult, but that's the threshold, that's the fence you need to balance on, because that's the only way you're going to make it in this profession and keep evolving and not, plateau. So on the side of listening to nobody, it means that, you should absorb what the critics have to say, but don't let it define you. Don't let it destroy you, for sure. And also, don't let it make you think that you're fucking God's gift to the world, right?
Right, yeah, in one way or the other, right? And in the good way and in the bad way, don't let it affect you too much.
Yeah. And going back to what you were saying about you don't know how the review is going to play out because of the specific combination of critics and whatever. Also from that, the value of this whole review process for the student has more to do with yourself internally and less to do with external stuff. It's really important that you go through the process of finalizing stuff, printing it out or whatever the format is, pinning it up, giving a presentation, and getting feedback. It's not even so much, a lot of times I have to say, it's not even the feedback itself that's important about it. It's the whole, it's the process, it's the whole routine. Right? It's that last bit of the journey, before the big midpoint or before the final that you need to go through, right? It's the last level in the game of Mario you need to go through. It doesn't even have to do so much with the specific feedback you're getting, right?
And also it doesn't really have to do with what the project actually ends up being, to be honest. That's not what's important.
In a way. Yeah. And so briefly, that's also, I would say for students, and any educators listening will understand this, you have to pin up, students. You have to pin up. Always show up, always pin up. Always those two things. Even if it's shit, even if you have nothing to pin up, fucking sketch something on some toilet paper, pin it up on the wall. Okay. And if you truly don't pin anything up, you have to at least be there. the worst thing you can do is just not show up and go AWOL and not tell anybody.
You have to be there, and don't try and hide if you're there by not participating to other people's review and not asking questions, like... Well, you kind of have to compensate, right? It's like you show up to a dinner party with empty hands and everyone brought a dish. While, don't show up to just eat the food. You have to chit-chat, you have to mingle, you have to help do the dishes, at least help bring something to other people. That's what I'm saying.
I agree with that, yeah.
And because the teacher would know that you don't have anything to show. So it just doesn't make you look good, and you didn't do your work, you're not putting anything up on the wall, but maybe there is something that you can still learn by being in the room and, participating. So
yeah, definitely. You might be saying to yourself, well, I'm not going to learn anything about these other projects because I think their work is trash and I'm super conceptual, dude. I'm not going to pin up because I don't pin up work that's not up to my standards. Drop the ego. Pin up your stuff, but also...
Or you struggle, and that's why you haven't pinned up anything today, but other people are pinning up, and maybe you didn't understand how they got to that point, or, and maybe that's a way that they can help you move forward.
Yeah, and you never know. There could be some nugget of information that a critic drops that's going to be really important to you. And let's say you go throughout the entire 8-hour day, you see all the presentations and all the feedback, and you're not wowed by any of it. You don't really gain a whole lot from that. Still doesn't matter because you've learned something by being part of this whole process. And on the one hand, like I said, like this becomes, the architecture reviews in school become their own kind of special thing. But again, there's a lot of things to be learned about the politics of it and how people relate to each other that's going to be translated directly to the professional setting. So always be there. So I think maybe we stay with the students a bit more and say a few more things, and we're going to talk about critics and formats.
So the idea behind this episode is to kind of talk about reviews from different perspectives, because it is not just about the presenter, it's also about the people who coordinate that day, people who sit and critiques the projects, and maybe the feedbacks themselves. So we're going to try and cover a little bit of all of that.
And I think it's something you need to realize as a student. And really, a student is we say that word and we have assumptions of what that means. We think it means someone younger, someone who doesn't know as much, is naive perhaps, doesn't have the skills, etc. But that's not the case. A student is anybody who's trying to learn, right?
Right. And I think it's also good if teachers were listening to this episode, because sometimes you're so used to scheduling reviews and kind of like putting them on the calendar that you actually don't question them or the way you run them. So maybe there is some insights from what we've experienced that could be helpful to make reviews better for everybody.
I think so. And the students understanding the reviews from the perspective of the critics is the same thing as when you practice as an architect. The better you can understand this whole thing from the perspective of the client, the more successful the conversation will be, the better the work you can do, and all these other things. It's a kind of it's not very smart to go through any process and be thinking, I only need to think about it from my view, right? Well, no, even though you're only 19 years old or 21 years old, right, and your teacher is like 50 years old or whatever, you should try and think from their perspective and from the critics, because then you're going to start to realize all of the holes in their logic. All right, so one thing I want to say for the students is that don't show up to a review and expect it to be all ponies and unicorns and rainbows and happiness. It's not supposed to be that way. I think a lot of students, especially in the beginning, right, it seems so harsh to them. Oh, you're saying such harsh things about my project, but this is my baby. I created it. And, oh, now I'm showing in front of the world and it's tearing me down.
I think it's hard, especially if it's like, you're in first year. It's one of your first reviews and you're just making your first steps into the world of design and you put it together. You're so proud of yourself, like you made it, but it's crap. Like, it's fine. It's normal. You're just starting. You're growing.
The thing with this is it's an attitude thing, and it's important to talk about because there has been, in some cases, like a shift toward making sure everyone's happy, making sure everyone's positive and encouraging and stuff. Yeah, fine. Encouraging is fine, but no critique is worth anything if there isn't negative criticism, right? I don't pin up, as a person who is used to be a student in school, but still a student in life, I don't pin up or show people stuff wanting just to hear praise all the time. I do it sometimes, but if I pin up at a review, I want to know what's wrong. It's the same thing as if you go to a
doctor.
If you go to a doctor, or you hire if you play soccer and you hire like a tutor or coach. I don't go to a tutor expecting them to just praise me. I don't want a yes man. I want to know what's wrong and how I can improve. Okay, inherently, within that context, they're going to say stuff that's wrong with what you're doing, right? So students who are so offended by this, or are so upset, right? Don't be. Yeah, relax, drop the shoulders. Don't be upset. This is the process. You want to get better, right? This is what's wrong. By the way, everyone has gone through this. This is what it means to be a designer. It means to look at it and to see all the million things that are wrong with it, and then to figure out how to improve, right? So I think that's both for the critics and for the students. For the students, it's like, don't freak out. It's supposed to be this way. And also, a student, if you get all the critics and they're saying nothing but great stuff, that should make you angry, because they're wasting your time. They're wasting your money or your parents' money. That's not what they're there to do, right? I
think it's a very good thing to say, to kind of set up your mindset before you do that review, right? You're not there to be praised. You're really there to get something in return. To learn, right? And I think that helps also to kind of dropping the pressure on that day, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's not going to be perfect, and you want the diagnosis of what is not good, right? And you want it honestly and not packaged in a sort of way.
That's not to say that critics should be mean toward the person. There are some critics who are just cruel, and it's not necessary. And so as a student, right, you need to look at a person, anyone you meet, or a critic, and what they say. You need to be able to kind of dissect it and be like, okay, is what they're saying fair? Is it relevant to what I'm doing, right? Are they just being, kind of an asshole for whatever's sake? Or are they being what I perceive to be harsh, but in fact, they're just speaking bluntly? There's a difference between speaking bluntly and then attacking someone. And usually for most people, it's pretty obvious the differences. And it's not good when we allow ourselves to blur those lines, either as the person who is assaulting and also as the student or as the educator. They're not the same, right? Speaking honestly and succinctly, not the same thing as being mean. Right. And this is something also that I've appreciated about design reviews and studio, is like, that's the one place where we don't need to worry about, right, dressing it up with Thousand Island and whatever. It's just greens. I'm just going to give you the facts, because that's the fastest way to move forward.
Yeah, and I don't want to start getting into like the whole feedbacks and critics quite yet, but to that, I would say too that oftentimes students, after they're done presenting, they're kind of just like receiving the critics, mm-hmm. but it's not really a back and forth, or like you're free to ask them questions. You're free to respond to what they're saying about your project. You're not just there to like get punches. You can also like poke or punch back if you feel like you have to. Yeah. It's not... And I think oftentimes it's kind of an opportunity that's dismissed, or maybe because the students are too much under the emotion of receiving the critics because they are not in the right mindset when they stepped in the room. Mm-hmm. They kind of shut down after they're done presenting, and the critics only goes one way. Yeah. But like you said, like it's a process, and I think you really have to respond to them. You have to ask them questions too. You have to disagree if you strongly disagree with them and you do have a point. It's not... There is a teacher and there is a student, but the hierarchy during those reviews is kind of blurred. Mm-hmm. Like it's almost like you're both in your underwear on stage. Like there is no master and then student. It's like you're equal. You can say whatever you have to say.
I think that's a good point, because also that's when the best learning happens. Because I think there's obviously pressure when you go to give a presentation like this, and there's this build up, right? And let's say you organize and you've rehearsed, and you have this message you're going to deliver, and it's a very kind of like fixed, very structured way of like thinking about the thing. But after you give the presentation, and even during it to a certain degree, the most rewarding learning experience and the most you gain is when everyone drops all of that kind of pretense and it's just like, let's have a talk. Like, how do you actually feel about this? Or the student says, you know what? I said this, I'm not sold on it. What do you think? Right. The more, this goes back to honesty, which is something we talk about a lot in this podcast, the more you can remove all of these layers of I don't know what, of separation, or all the structure of like, it has to be this way. I'm supposed to pitch this thing and convince everyone I'm great.
Right.
The more you can just shed all of that and have an underwear to underwear conversation, the better. Right.
And it's the most constructive. And it's like, again, your time presenting is so limited. It's so small. In the same time, you have all of these critic, meaning resources, available to you at this moment. You gotta squeeze as much juice as you can from that exchange. It cannot just be, passive and detached. Like, you really have to get engaged with them. And going back to the point that sometimes critics are being mean, you can also call them out if they're being mean. Like, you can also be like, I think you're looking at the wrong thing, or like. I feel like sometimes somebody needs to say something, and it should be the student because it's coming at you.
Yeah. So there's two thoughts I have on that. The first is, I always felt when I was going through school, and this will sound how it's going to sound, I always felt the critics I had were full of shit and they didn't know anything. And I would always show up at a review, and I had always a strange thing where I was super amped to get it done, partly because I was always really unorganized, and so the ampness was there because of caffeine. And then I would always have this crash right before the presentation, right, where I'm like, it's so weird actually. I'm like, I just don't care anymore. And I would actually get angry, but not angry at anybody, not angry at the critic, just angry. Like, I just don't care. Like, why am I having to sell my ideas to these people? Because I don't believe these people have anything to contribute anyway.
Well, that, or you wait for your turn to go and present, or you watch the critics go on about other students. And I kind of like, they could.
There's something about fairness, right? For me, that was always at play. Unfair that this kid got all the great credit, even though he didn't do any work. And I know it's crap. The teacher knows it's crap, but he's getting lauded. Unfair that this kid gets torn apart, but he has some good stuff, and the critics, they just went on a weird tangent. Unfair that I presented and they didn't listen to anything that I said, right? The point is with that is that, again, it goes back to you have to imagine, right, that the teachers have invited, let's say, 6 different people. A lot of times, well, they try to get the best people that they want. A lot of times it's scheduling conflicts, so they just get whoever they get, right? Not always, but 50% of the time that's the case. Or they're expected to invite a certain person because they're part of the school that they're at or whatever. So you have, more or less a random catching of 6 people, and you expect all those people to be awesome and to give great feedback, to understand design, understand what it means to educate, understand what it means to give, be a critic, right? Understand what it means to think as a student. You expect all 6 to do that, and not going to happen, right? And I think as a student, it's important to realize that that's the variables you're dealing with, right? Now, is it healthy to show up at a review thinking, all of you sons of bitches don't know anything, but I'm going to tell you because I have to, and then I'm going to leave the stage and I don't care? Probably not. But the other thing that what you said reminded me of is that, like you were saying, the students, like, take control to learn, to get the most out of it. The reality is a lot of teachers are not good teachers, and a lot of teachers are not good designers. Okay. Now, if you're in a case where you feel like that might be the situation, you take control of the review for yourself. This gets to further topics of how you structure a review, but how many times have we all been to an architecture critique? You start late. You're supposed to have 10 minutes per student or 15 minutes or whatever. The teacher lets it go on for 20, 25. Then now you're stuck with 7 minutes left. Or you're trying to start presenting, but your classmates are dicking around in the back, or the teacher's talking, or whatever's happening, right? You cannot rely on other people to control the situation, make it ideal. You do that then as the presenter. Right. You shouldn't have to be doing that as a student. You should not have to be doing that, but you're probably going to have to, so you do it. And I've always appreciated, something I always tell my students is that, and I always appreciate when they step up and they take control, and those tend to be the ones that learn the most in the end, not just from the review, but from other things too. because they realize like, no, I'm not the victim always. I don't have to be, I'm not the subject, right?
No, and this is all detrimental to your mindset during your performance and to your project. And it's about, like you say, it's about fairness, right? If the guy before you, everything was perfect for him, and it's not for you because, you know, people are dicking around in the audience and starting late and whatever, well, that's unfair. So, you know, you should, just take control over it.
And this is something also we said in the presentation recordings, right? You like when you go to give your presentation, you set up your stuff, you get the space right before you begin. You control the things you can control to make the ideal outcome for you. The outcome being not only just winning people over, but again, learning. Another point that I think students should realize is that, like I said before, the critics are not all powerful or all knowledgeable. They're not the Wizard of Oz. Right. And sometimes students think of them that way, in part because students, I think, are looking for, reassurance.
Well, that, and also they don't know, but they do know that these people are professional and with experience, and they have done things that that students don't know about.
Yes. And
you have a natural tendency in just putting them up on a pedestal when they might not even belong.
Yes. And I think that it's human nature to do that. When there's this mysterious quality, you elevate them, but you've got to drop that. You have to ignore that tendency as much as possible as a designer, right? That's not the case.
But I feel it's like in an office when you start, you know, there's another kid of your age and like, oh, that guy's probably like way better than me and all of that. Then you work for a month or two and you realize he doesn't know shit. You know, you're the newbie, but you're actually like way more advanced.
Right. Yeah, that's funny.
It's the unknown,
or you assume that this person, they've been here for like 10 years. Oh, shoot, they started like a week before me. Let's go get lunch. Let's talk shit about the boss because we don't know anybody. So that mystery gap is definitely there. But also it's that assurance of what I meant is like, what does it mean to be a designer? It means to always be surrounded by a bunch of questions. And then when you feel like you're about to get the answer, you force more questions on yourself. So you're always in this state of being lost to a certain degree, right? And that would sound weird to a client, right? I'm hiring you to be lost, but that is the case. That's how we push the boundaries. And for students, when they're starting off, it's very uncomfortable. Super uncomfortable to be like this. And they're always looking for something to latch on to give them assurance, right? Well, this guy's a professional, right? Mysterious gap, whatever. I don't know what he's doing, but he's a professional. He said this. Let me just clamp onto that because at least I know if I do that, then one, there's a higher chance it's going to be right because this professional told me. Two,
right.
I don't have to take responsibility. And I think for a lot of people, that's not very conscious. You don't consciously think of your choices that way, but it's there. It's 100% there. You clamp onto things because you're like, less stressful, right? Just tell me what number I should do. What do I do? This is what students are saying. And so that's also why I think the students, you don't think that just because the critics say something, you have to do it or that you should be doing it.
Or that they're right.
Absolutely.
That's why teachers will invite multiple people, because if they were going to invite only one person, well, that person's point of view and judgment might not be the right one and might not be the only one. So that's why you have an array of different people and opinions, because ultimately that's what you're trying to get, right?
And there's two more reasons why, two more things on this particular issue. The first is that architecture is fascinating and difficult because it can be understood from many different angles. You know, the social, the formal, et cetera. So we're talking about these things. All right. That's what makes it complex. So you throw that into the mix, layered on top of the number of critics and the day of the week and whether or not they just, had a bad day with their boss or whatever. And that's all in flux. So it's not a good idea to say, to take notes diligently. Oh, that's good. But it's not a good idea to do that and then say, oh, go back to your desk, be like, okay, I'm just going to do all the things the critic says. Check, 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 check.
Yeah, because you're getting it wrong. Like, it's not about, pleasing or satisfying the critics or your teacher. It's about yourself, your growth, your process, your learning. It's not about satisfying anybody at the end, but helping you move forward. Yeah,
I totally agree. And that's a weird kind of conceptual, philosophical thing. But it's at that balance again, right? Listening to everybody but nobody. You need to allow yourself, students, to feel super uncomfortable and never be settled in that sense, right? The other thing too, with how you should understand or deal with critics' feedback is a lot of the critics, they are not teachers. And if they are teachers, they might not be great ones, which means that a lot of times they don't give feedback thinking about how much time you have left in the class, right? They don't think from your perspective, which is their fault entirely. But I will say that 95% of the feedback I've seen at reviews does not take into consideration the students' reality of their life, how much time they have left, where they are in the project, what their skill sets are, et cetera, et cetera. And this gets to other issues of focusing on the work and not the student. So that means for you need to recognize, are they telling me this understanding that I only got like 4 weeks left and I got other finals and stuff and I don't know the program they're talking about? Because if you think that they are not understanding your position, it might invalidate a fair amount of what they have to say.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Not invalidated. It might invalidate it, or it might make it just not applicable.
And I think that's also something to think about to prepare for your review is the fact that these people don't know anything about you. They don't know anything about where you're from or how much time you have left to live as a student. Like this is all like have to kind of like put your own presentation and work into that kind of perspective because oftentimes students forget that, they think the teacher is in the room and he knows, therefore everybody who's relating to the teacher knows and he's transfer his information to them prior to my presentation. None of that happens. So that's why, go back to our presentation recording and make sure you hit those points because those critics are just here for a couple hours and then they're gone.
Yeah, then they're back.
Or they're back next semester.
Yeah. So I think in terms of getting information as a person who's being critiqued, you get the information, you have it written down or it's recorded or whatever. Then there's another step where you go back at your desk and you sit in silence and you think, okay, what am I going to do with this information? Right? There's always that magic translating process that happens with anything as a good problem solver, as a designer. You can't have a client meeting. The client says, I want orange couches and blue walls and green lamps. Okay. Whoop. Goes right in there. Guess what? Check, 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 check. We got those things. Can't do that.
And so first thing, I think, that's totally right. After you're done with your presentation, before you go celebrate with your friend, take like half an hour, sit down in a quiet spot and like write down everything that you remember that they've said about your project. Not that you're going to follow exactly what they said to finish it or redo it or whatever, but just put it down on paper so it doesn't fly anywhere, right? Yeah. And then the next step is
then go celebrate.
Then go celebrate. And then the next day, wake up and go back to those notes and actually try to extract the main essence of those notes. Mm-hmm. It's not about like the specifics of it. It is more about, well, what was the big idea behind what they said? That's really what's going to be constructive for your next review. Not so much that you should have put a door here instead of there, but more like, oh, maybe you should have thought about it differently, or in your process, you missed a step, and therefore that took you there instead of here,
I think this also goes back to the understanding anything in terms of the 3 layers of the why, the how, and the what. And a lot of times feedback just focuses on the what. Move the door. This door shouldn't be like that.
Right.
If you're a student and you just take the what and you make the what happen, it doesn't work. You need to understand, you need to be a detective and think about, okay, how should I go about doing this, right? And why did the person say this? That's a really big thing. Why did they say this?
And a lot of time, I think students think that after they're done presenting and they're done with their critics, that's it. The work is done. But no, actually, it's not really done. You really have to do that extra step after you're done presenting, taking those notes down and thinking about what happened to really use that for the next one. And that might sound like, oh, wow, like these people are crazy. Like no one does that after reviews. Well, guess what? No, everyone should be doing that because that's really
everybody.
It's really what's going to help you. Otherwise, what? You're hoping you're going to grow organically in the right way, Like, no, you're not.
Right. That's where also for my students, if there's a review, I always have a meeting at the end of the review as a class to kind of like come together because it's a nice way to kind of, wrap the thing. And then if I get a chance, well, no, actually, in the middle or the end of the semester, doesn't matter. The next class, I have a debriefing with each student about what happened. Well, the thing we just talked, I do that with the student.
Right.
Because I don't trust the student to understand it on their own, right? Because what kind of teacher would I be if I didn't? And that's really important. And if you're a student and you have a review and your teacher is not going to help you with understanding and translating and digesting or comprehending what was said, you tell the teacher, hey, can we talk about what happened? Because they said this, I didn't understand it. They said this, I felt like that was unfair. And the teacher will give you some context. The why, how, what, right? So the example of the door is something I just used because you said it. I don't mean to say that the why, like why did they say that? Because it's to code that I need to have X number of doors. I don't mean that. I mean, that's potentially part of it too, but I mean even in the context of the review and the people. Why did they say it? Did they say that because no one else was saying anything? I just need to throw something out. Did they say that because of who they are? They're a freaking code person? Okay, well that tells you something about the
array of architects in the profession.
The level of feedback you're getting from that person,
For
right?
Sure, yeah.
Did they say it because they panicked? Like, you need to read the room, right? It's the same thing when you're talking with a client. You can't just listen to what they say. Why phone calls are better than emails, why in-person is better than phone calls. There's all these nuances of what's happening in the moment, which informs what people think and say, because most people are subject to changing based on the dynamics of all the things happening, because they don't have the will to just kind of like be consistent, right? And you need to recognize that and take that into consideration. That's a huge, huge factor, right?
Right.
Again, not all information is equal in the designing of a project and certainly in the feedback of a project. It's not the case, right?
No, and like you said, for the critics, it's difficult to be a good critic at the moment because it's a lot to absorb and try to understand in a very short period of time. And oftentimes students are not good at doing the communication job to present a project. So it's a lot of, trying to dissect, but putting it together so it makes sense in your brain. And based on that, you have to give some kind of constructive feedbacks and in a clear way, and you have to process all of that information super, super fast. So yeah, like you said, some of them, they just panic and they just like pick on whatever they see first on the board because that's the easiest, and they've done their participation, and then the next person.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of that. But also sometimes it's just, it takes more to understand the project and get deeper into the critics. So that's why it's always great when there is a lot of different people invited, because you really have more chances in getting a little more, constructive feedbacks than just the code guy who's just going on about the doors.
There's always a code guy.
There is always a code guy. And I think it's important that you know the different types of critics' personality out there.
Yeah.
So when they start speaking, you can kind of be like, okay, this guy, I'm not going to get anything from him. It's just going to be code stuff. This one, she's super theoretical. Like, she goes on to her conceptual things. I don't get it. I'm not gonna,
Right.
Like you kind of have to know the different personalities.
No, of course, because the information is coming from a human being, right? So it has these layers of context to it. And again, context is everything. And giving a presentation, creating a design, context is key. The only last note I have really to do with just students specifically is like, how do you handle bad feedback? Feedback that's negative, feedback that's harsh. I don't mean poor as in the quality is bad, but just like negativity, right? I suppose we talked about it a little bit in the beginning, but one, welcome it, because you want that. If you don't have that, it's not productive.
Right. So it's good. So think bad feedbacks, it's money in the banks for you.
And I did one other note is just don't get angry at them.
Or don't start crying. I get really angry, I want to cry, and it's really not. You don't want that.
It's not a review unless at least 3 people cry,
or they cry after. Wow, that's a little better. But don't cry and stay calm.
Crying is not a problem in my book because it just means there's a lot of emotions
but then
happening.
You're all sniffing and running, and it grows, and you don't have tissue, and it's not.
I know. I mean, on the one hand, it's. When you're older and you look back, it's like, it's ridiculous. Like, who cares? It's, it's school. But it's just, crying just means that you happen to be more emotional than other people, that you care a lot. But, there are limits to that too. You can't, if you're a person who did no work by your choice, it wasn't like, you were sick for most of the semester, but you just didn't do work and you pinned up and you start crying. I'm gonna fail you. Like, I don't care if you're crying. I don't care if it hurts. You put yourself in this situation, you're gonna deal with it. If you're a student who worked really hard and you got negative feedback and you're crying, great. It means you care, right?
Right.
It means you care. At some point you need to kind of suck it up because you can't be crying in front of clients.
You need to be
but
And if the fact that you're crying, it's because you are not prepared to get bad or harsh feedbacks about what you've produced.
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe ask your friends, during the semester to critique your project and be mean about it. Try and practice that a little bit so you get a little tough skin before the day off.
It also goes through your expectations, right?
And it also goes to your expectation.
Right.
Just expect that you're gonna. Well, but that's the thing. You cannot go and be like, "Oh, I'm gonna fail," because it's not a good mindset, right? You have to go and be like, "You're gonna do your best, but it's not gonna be perfect." You are going to have criticism because that is what a review is about.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is not a graduation ceremony where you have a gown and you get candy and money and everybody's cheering you up. That's not graduation yet. It's a review. It's a critic.
Right. Yeah. It's a good,
right?
That's yes, absolutely.
I feel like a lot of students, they just take it as like a mini graduation celebration of, oh, look how great I am. Yeah. I've been drawing things and it's on the wall now. And it's like, no.
That's perfectly said. And also you have to realize that even if somehow you had a time machine, you do your presentation and you went back and you did everything the critics asked, and the same exact events happened again, the same people, the same temperature in the air, same everything, same hors d'oeuvres at the review, they would still find something to say different.
They're detective.
There's always something.
They're hunting for the thing that is not right. If there are good critics, I think, like you said, there's nothing worse than a panel of professionals who are actually not being professional with you during that day because they're not giving you the things you came here for, which is criticism.
Yeah, I agree. All right. To the feedback itself, I had to take out a cushion. I was too high.
It's like when like when I asked my mom, like, "Oh, what do you think of this?" And she's like, "Oh, you're great. Oh, this is great." And I'm like, "No, but that's not true. Like, give me the truth. Like, I want to know."
No,
I'm not 3 years old anymore. I know Santa Claus doesn't exist. Stop lying to me, right?
Yeah. The feedback. So students, critics, everyone, you have to understand that there's 2 components to the presentation feedback kind of loop. There is what the student is trying to do and whether or not they did it, how well they did it. Those are the only 2 parts to it. And everything you hear at a review should be understood through that lens, right?
That's a very good point.
And as a critic, I cannot say this more. It's like if there's one key takeaway, it would probably be this point for me. And critics have to understand this too. Most critics don't go to review thinking about these 2 components or layers, but they're there, right? As soon as someone says something, student, you have to think to yourself, okay, is he agreeing with what I'm trying to do? Or is he disagreeing with what I'm trying to do or disagreeing with how I did it? A lot of times critics will go on this whole thing, but its premise is not the same one that I'm trying to initiate in my project, right? It's like, yeah, that's fine, and you're critiquing this and that, but that's actually not what I'm trying to do. So we should go back to step 1, right? So for me, it's like, do first the idea is one way to look at it. Do I agree with the idea or do I not agree with the idea? Then the second part is execution. Right. It's always those 2 things.
Yeah, that's why, I have a very hard time with critics who judge like the actual design or per se aesthetic of what's on the board, because it comes down to, okay, does it look beautiful or not? And then and if not, it's a matter of taste. Do I like it or do I not like it? And that's not constructive. Once again, you need criticism that could help you develop multiple projects in the future, not just that one specific one.
Yes. Design education, architecture education is about learning a process more than anything else. It is about learning a way of thinking and a process, a way of working more than anything else. Now, that process is not directly taught to you by a teacher. It's not like step 1, step 2, step 3, because it's complicated. It's very personal. It's this weird hybrid of you learning as an individual, individually, personally at your desk, and also getting external feedback. But it's about learning process. And whether or not something is good or bad at a review is only defined by what the student tried to do. That's the context of the project, right? You need to have that baseline to work off of. That's the only thing that's your zero, right? That's the ground plane that you're working. If you don't establish that, you could say whatever you want, you could present anything, the critic could say anything, means nothing because you don't have a sense of gravity. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like you said, I think it's pretty. Okay, well, based on what? Right.
So that's the thing. Like you nailed it, right? You are like, it is about the process, like what you try to do. It could be about the concept, like you had a groundbreaking way of developing the project and starting and developing it, right? Or the last thing is, like you said, the execution. Mm-hmm. You have beautiful documents, beautiful rendering, hand sketches, or graphics that you develop your own technique. There's something to talk about there because you developed something that is your own, right? Mm-hmm. That is important in the process of yourself, right? But a lot of critics, oftentimes, I feel like they kind of get fooled by the beautiful execution or by the beauty of a design, and they kind of forget the other criteria that they have to look at as a critic. Again, so that comes down to having a panel of multiple people, because if you only have a few and you are amazing with hand drawings, well, they're all going to be praising your hand drawing skills, but you already know you're good at it, right? Yeah.
And I think also there's another way to have a critique happen, which is, you can critique the idea itself. The critics can't just accept whatever you're pitching. So there's feedback on how to execute the idea, and there's feedback on how okay, how do I put this? There's feedback, which is about the process to creating an idea, mm-hmm. and there's feedback on the process to making that idea real and then creating the building. Those two parts, and both we would talk about both in review, right? Your idea was crap because your research was invalid, right. Or your research was good but you translated it incorrectly. Okay, there's that. However, let's say for the moment we just accept that you try to do this. That's your idea. Great execution, right? Or inverse, or neither, or whatever. But it's distinctly those two parts. There's distinctly those two parts.
And, to people who listen to this episode and who maybe have been critics in jury, in reviews before, or have the intent to, but you're not quite sure, what kind of feedbacks am I going to be providing? Well, I think going with those kind of 3 different ways to look at it is a good start. And it's a good start for the students, too, to receive criticism, because if they're good at developing a concept, at doing their research, or they're good at graphics or make communication skills, like graphic communication, but the lack of understanding of shape and materials, and, they need to know what they need to work on next. Yeah. So I think, those big categories are kind of basic, but there is a lot to dive into.
You see, this is where also you get critics who actually don't know what it means to design something. And this doesn't apply to all academics or all professionals or all code people, but, a lot of professional academics who teach, they can't design. They don't know how to design. That's not their life. Or you get whoever else doesn't know how to design. So what I'm saying is that when you're a designer and you're cognizant of the process, you think this way. You realize that there's the research, right? There's the creation of the idea. Then there's the execution of the idea into the thing. And then there's representation of that thing on the board. That's fucking it, right? And as a designer, when you're struggling with your own work, you always do, you think to yourself, okay, I'm struggling at this point. where in that timeline, right, did I mess up? Where's the weak spot? It falls somewhere on that timeline. Right. And you hunt for that moment. And when you know it, it's within this segment, right? Then I can go and fix it, right? We've talked about this numerous times on this podcast, even with like Anne Fougeron, who's amazing architect. She had said even a lot of times when they're struggling on something in the office,
miss a step.
There's something before. There's something before that we missed.
It's like when you do like website, just because we have to read on our website, right? And you do like script, like HTML or like CSS script, and it's line, right? Like line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you have a bunch of codes and things, and then you like hit save or valid. There is an error somewhere, but it doesn't tell you where. Well, you have to backtrack and find where that error is missing because it is not making your code working. It's kind of the same. It
is very much the same. So when you get a critic, when there's an issue with your project that falls, let's say at the very end, meaning the thing, the building itself, a formal thing, or I don't like the shape of the windows or whatever, and the way that they talk about that is they're just focused on that segment of the timeline, as I'm calling it. But that's a terrible way to give feedback, and there's a good chance that they don't know how to design, because when designers have a very good sense of process, because you have to. That's the only way you can create anything, right? And when you get all this information from critics, from Google Earth, from whatever, it gets funneled and organized in a certain way, and you kind of see where information goes. So when I'm giving a presentation, I get a critic, and they say something that's totally without any inkling of where it falls into the process, I think to myself, okay, one is what you're saying valid or not. It could still be valid, but I don't think you know what you're actually talking about, because if you did know how to design, you would not have said that, or you would have said it very differently than what you just did. That's all. So what I'm saying is that sometimes you get weird ass feedback from like left field, and as a student, and a lot of times as a student, you don't understand because you're too young. But in other cases, you understand it because it's bad feedback.
Right. That's another thing you have to be aware is that not all feedback is going to make it into, your note and the process of building yourself.
And this reminds me that I've seen a lot of times at reviews where we'll be talking about the building, right? And we're talking about the building, and the students presented their process, which is pretty common. Like, I went through these steps. This is what I tried to do, right? End up here. And they end up something that has nothing to do with what they tried to do. But what they have in the end is actually pretty interesting, but for very different reasons. Whole review about why this thing is interesting for different reasons. And the critics, and that is a worthwhile conversation for sure, but that cannot dominate the conversation because, again, design education is about learning a process. And the critics say to me, I don't really care about how they got here. Let's just talk about the thing because the thing is interesting for these other reasons. Not important that the student didn't realize how they got here. It's important that they got to somewhere good, even if they didn't understand it. And I say to myself, wait a second.
That's the problem.
How do you expect them to create anything great the next time?
That's the thing. It's like a lot of times, those students, they just got lucky.
Got lucky.
In a way, right? Like, how can you expect a second-year student to design an amazing-looking building? Well, maybe they have a good eye, but did they understand how they got there? And could they use that same eye or build that same eye for next projects to come? Because, the ultimate goal is, once again, not to win that review, but to win yourself for the next however many decades you're going to have to design stuff, right? You need to set up that toolbox, and you're going to carry your whole life to design and design and design again. It's not a one-time thing.
Yeah, and you're not helping them establish that toolbox, that's for sure.
And those critics aren't. And it's infuriating because it's actually very selfish.
Yep.
Because they're designers, they love things that are beautiful and interesting, and they got distracted. They fell in their own trap, basically, right? So if you have critics like that who are really focusing on the shape, and you feel like, okay, well, it looks like you got that right, there's no need to spend more time on that, right? Spend more time on what was not right.
This gets to a big point, which is that when you're giving feedback and when you're receiving feedback, like, are we talking about the work, the building, or are we talking about the student? You have to talk about both, right? I'm not saying you have to exclude one or the other, but there tends to be too much focus on the artifact itself, the building itself.
You mean the criticism, the feedbacks that they get?
The feedback is about the building.
Right.
I don't mean to say, okay, well, let me preface by saying, there's this thing of like, we should talk about the subject at hand and not attack the student. Of course, we're not, well, this depends. We're not attacking the student, we're attacking the project. But actually, that's not, now that I say it, that actually doesn't really apply to design reviews, right? Because the student is the one who's authoring the thing, right? So help the student, right? The building actually doesn't need help. The building is indifferent to what any of us think, right? Help the creator figure out how they make it something better. And that's a big mistake that critics, academics, a lot of people have, right? I don't like this thing, move this thing around, turn it upside down, chop that apart off to be interesting. Oh, look at this by Pulver, look at this by that architect, because it looks kind of like whatever. But there's a human being making this, right? And you're helping them, right?
But that's the thing.
You're meant to be helping them.
The problem with these critics is that they are playing architect at a critic.
Well said.
When they should actually be playing teacher at a critic. They're not there. A lot of them say those things because they want to play with the object. They want to develop it. They want to pull things around and try things on the student's project because that's what they're used to do. They dream with like CAD and 3D models all the time, right? But that's not what they should be doing that day, because the students that's not what they need that day.
And this is not to say that when you get to review that you as a critic you shouldn't be talking about the building. Of course you have to talk about the building, but there's a difference between talking about the building for the building's sake versus talking about the building as a means to communicate to the student a lesson, an idea, right? So you can communicate things to the student that they're meant to learn either directly. Right. Okay. Let's talk about your process. You should not have done this at that point in the process. You should have done more drawing or more this or that. Right. That's more like shaping the student themselves. You can do that by talking through the building, but again, it's different than just tunnel vision. Right.
It's different, and sometimes the students are also very detached from what they've produced. Yes. I know as a student, I never was very happy about what I would put on the wall because I was always very critical about what I would do. So when they talk about what's on the wall, I'm like, yeah, but you know what? I know it's not right. So tell me what's not right with who I am or who I'm trying to be or how I'm trying to get there, right?
And it's a balance. It's somewhere between, and like you say, I think when you're a younger designer, or even just through the process in general, there's different levels of distance you have from the work. Sometimes you need more distance for objectivity. Sometimes you should have less distance. And in the case of students, when there's too much of a gap, right? As a critic, you need to recognize that there's a gap. And if I just talk about this object, it's actually having no effect to them. Their fucking eyes are glazed over.
And that's
you need
a big
to recognize
problem.
That. Yeah.
Like I remember classmates who were very, very detached from what they were producing. And like you said, if you go back in the timeline, that means there was a problem somewhere, and you need to identify where that problem was to make them, to reconcile them with what they're producing.
Yeah.
When you have students and it's very painful for them to design things, okay, we have a bigger issue than the actual building here, right? Like, where is the problem coming from?
I think, too, something you said, it reminded me that you said it was like being self-centered or very selfish. Right?
It's selfish.
And that reminds me that there's been, maybe it's always been there, maybe it's growing, I don't know, but there's definitely a certain sector of critics within certain schools where the feedback is actually more for the critics and less for the students. What I'm saying is that, why are we here? We're here to help students, help them learn to become better designers. A lot of critics forget that. They're more interested in showing off, making themselves look good. There's all that stuff we'll get into. Yep. But also, not about that. They're more interested in having interesting dialogue between the other teachers and other critics, right? Because we're advanced compared to the student. It's a stupid thing to say, but that's where we're at. I want to have a conversation about like the nuances of this or that. Okay, that's great. But that's not why you're here.
That's so rude. Because,
do that after the fact.
Yeah, that's so rude because oftentimes these people, like you said, they're having like a micro conversation within a bigger world, and they're completely like, curtaining off the the student who's actually is the person we should be talking to today.
And some academics, they like that. They like confrontation, and to be frank, they like to put coals in the fire to see how much more back and forth they can get. And I honestly think that a lot of it's ego. It's cool to have this kind of thing happen because then we're contesting things and we're debating. And in the capital A architecture, the highest level, fantastic. Let's do that all day. But if we're dealing with an undergraduate student, not the place for it, right?
We'll do a lecture
unless
debate,
maybe you're at thesis level, right? If you're at a master's degree, then maybe some of the stuff is good because the student is advanced enough to learn through that dialogue.
Or to participate.
Or to understand. If you maybe participate, right? Or understand it.
Right.
But a lot of times this stuff is happening. The student's neither of those things.
Yeah.
Confused again, right? I don't know what's happening. I don't understand half the words they're talking about. I don't understand the references they're using.
That's another thing. A lot of times, some critics and architects love name dropping of building, of famous architects, of movements, of whatever. If, you're interested in actually looking the things up that they're referring to, like make them spell it for you, like ask them, oh, who's that person? What did they do? Don't just let them spitball names of famous things just so that they can kind of spread, their culture on everyone.
There's different types of critics that you need to be aware of. There's academics, there's practitioners. Within practitioners, there's a whole range. There's the code guy who's always a code guy, a person that's interested in technical stuff. So like when you get into the profession, not all offices are structured this way, but generally there's an understanding. There's like project management, which has more to do with being organized and being a people person and talking with clients and stuff. There's the technical people, detail-oriented, construction details, how does stuff fit together, how does it become weatherproofed. There's draftsmen, basically just monkeys who just had a typewriter. That's not really quite right, but whatever, grunt work. And then there are the code people who just memorize the code. You go for them for information about that. So there's all these different types of practitioners, and you kind of need to be aware of that. And I don't know what role this critic has in the outside world, but there is a type of critic, all they want to do is throw out references all the time. Name dropping, like you said, but also references to other projects. You should look at this project by Mies. Look at this project by James Turrell. Look at this project, and this, In 1962, this was done by X and X for Y reason, and this happened there, and you should look at this thing. And sometimes that's good. You write it down, look it up afterwards. But I would say I'm very hesitant to do that a lot of times as a critic because that's not constructive feedback. What I'm doing is I'm telling the person a piece of information. I'm giving a name and a date, or name of an architect, name of a building, and I'm assuming that the student will give themselves their own feedback by looking at this project. How dumb is that? When I say it out loud, I'm like, what? That seems like a terrible idea.
It's a very tricky thing to compare a student's project or suggest other architecture in relationship to their building. Internet is there, it's on the phone, it's accessible. If a student wants to find out like building that looks like sponges, well, there's probably a Pinterest board with buildings with sponges. We don't need the critics to list them all that day. To me, it's more interesting when critics are suggesting references that are not architectural, but could help in the development of an idea, on the discovery of a working process, like related to, art, music, sports, like something that is outside of the box we're building as architecture students, for ourselves. Yeah. And, just remind you that there is other ways to think about the building than thinking about the building.
So there's two things. The only time I feel really that it's a good idea to just to drop a reference and then not talk about it is if you know the teacher really well. A lot of times critics know the teacher, and the teacher's going to walk them through that. An extended version of the review is going to happen at some point. That's kind of it.
Or trivia, but you know.
Yeah, because I mean, again, students put so much pressure on the information, and this goes back to students when you're listening to this. Like, don't put too much pressure on information. They go back and they obsess. This project by Hadid. What are the connections with my project? Am I supposed to copy it? Is it the form? Is it that says white? Is it because spaghetti? I don't know. I don't understand. But something is there. I'm going to spend the next week thinking about and obsessing over this.
It's hunting.
Terrible idea.
Yeah.
But the other thing that came to mind with what you said, what did you say? What did you say?
References outside of architecture?
Yes. That's a really good thing, I believe, because there is a tendency also for students, because they want that assurance, they're going to direct copy from a building, right? And that's not good. The other thing, too, is that the biggest struggle with a lot of students is that they need to break loose of the preconception of preconceptions of what architecture is. Buildings, building, columns and columns and walls and columns. No. No. And there is this thing in teaching design, which we might do a recording on. I don't know. We'll have to see if... I don't know. There is a thing in teaching design, which, given feedback is a form of teaching. You need to set them on the right path and have an understanding of the trajectory, but not give them the conclusion, because you're determining the answer.
Right.
And that's bad, because you're not teaching them process. It's bad because you are not...
You're digesting it for them.
Assuming that what you're going to propose is what they should propose as a very different human being, probably a very different age from you, right? They might come up with a better solution than you, critic. It's not your job to give them answers, right? And that's the danger when you refer other buildings. You tend to glob onto those as answers or partial answers. When you give a metaphor, right, or you use other industries, other art forms as a way to talk about things, that is a very powerful way to communicate an idea to someone, a trajectory to someone, a process to someone, but leaving it completely open for them to figure out what the final thing itself is going to be, right? I agree with
because the goal is, like you said, it's not to give them answers and like digested answers. It's just to show them doors for them to open and find out like what is interesting for them to get from that, you know? Like, I don't know, someone who's developing a city and that reminds you of the way a plant grow, or like, you know, like biology, because you're interested in that kind of stuff. Well, that could be super interesting, but the students has the option to go and look into it or not, and they might find something that could be very constructive for another project.
You know, then there comes the issue of like, you know, just doing the thing and completing the building enough to where you learn from it in the future, but that's up to the teacher to help them along. Right. I mean, there comes a point in time, and when the case of a lot of students where like they just need to do it, and the teacher does have to say just do it this way, and there's sort of a situation where the student might not be fully understanding of what they're producing, right? But that's fine, because the learning happens after the project is done, so you can learn retroactively. But that's a different scenario. That's a different thing.
And also, you know, you have 5 years in school, so not all of your drawings, not all the ways you're going to represent the building and the project will be the same from year 1 to year 5, right? Yeah. Hopefully year 5 you're going to have a lot more things to put on than year 1. So it's really about, not so much about having like, you know, like windows and door handles and like arches and dash line and all of that stuff in year 1. It's about kind of getting the big bones first, and then you know you're going to have to do those things. It doesn't need to happen right away. And if critics are picking on like representation things, for example, just, you know, put a note next year, make sure I have my doors in or something, like not a big deal.
Yeah, I think I've always been more interested in the ideas of things and the execution of things, but in school, at least when it came to like code issues, I was like, yeah, I don't give a shit. Like, this is clearly a fictional building, not gonna be built, right? And that's like, it's not really important for a student, especially at the undergraduate level, to understand the building code. And here's why. Because you can just read a book and learn it, right? The more challenging thing is, again, to learn how to design and how to think as a designer. And it really takes like 5 years to get to that point.
That and understand space.
Yes.
Like in France, we don't study code during school actually, which thinking about it is kind of weird, but we don't.
We don't. Well, I guess it depends on the school.
We know roughly the size of a door, but we don't really apply code. But the fact that maybe you decide not to show doors the first year because it's part of a conceptual approach to how you want to represent things.
Yes.
It's fine. Just be aware. The only thing I would say is that at some point you have to know where things go and what you have to have in a building, right? Mm-hmm. You have to have a toilet, you have to have doors and windows, right? And if you don't know that in year 5, that's kind of a big problem.
Yeah.
But don't be hunted by that.
Yes. It's funny. One of the things, there's 2 things I've heard so many times at reviews. There's 3 things, and they're all kind of similar. One is like, where's your north arrow? Right? Where's your north arrow? It's always some old dude who's like bald and is like, looks like he has clothes on that he's worn for the last like 60 years, 30 years, right? It's the same pair of clothes that he has on a hanger, and like they've molded to his body, and he kind of like just steps into them. He shows them. He's like, ugh. North arrow. Where's their north arrow? And all these kids who are limber like, what the fuck, north arrow, bro? Like, who gives a shit? We got Google and shit. Like, there ain't no north anymore, man. We're in virtual reality. And there's some truth to both sides of it, of course. And the other one is what was it? We should look at this in section. Like, your project should be studied more in section, right?
Well, that really depends on what's your project. Some projects are sections projects, meaning like the magic happens once you make a slice through it. Some other section sucks, and you just have to find like what best represents your project. And I think that goes back to teaching design and kind of like the components that you're supposed to have for a review. Again, you make your own rules.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think, with the north arrow thing, you should always have a north arrow because that's, we build things for this planet, and it's relevant pretty much in all instances for most projects of where north is, because that's the sun and a lot of other things. So just put it in there. The section thing, I always felt like it was a cop-out by a lot of critics. Sometimes it's valid, but a lot of times it's like, you're just saying that because that's what everyone says, And,
and also it depends how you make the section. Like, what is that the section is actually showing? Like, you have big atriums and, so therefore it's 2 section projects. Well, yeah, but is that where the magic happens? Mm-hmm. Once again, like, where is the magic in the project?
I think it's not a good thing if you're presenting and whatnot and then there's silence. If no one's saying anything, that's a really bad sign. If they're nitpicking on very particular things, it either means that they're a bad critic or you've done a good job and they got nothing else to say.
Yeah.
There's also a tendency for students to reject students tend to think that the design and the presentation of the design are separate things, which, yes, they are, but you have to realize in the context of an unbuilt project, they are not, because the presentation of the design is the only representation of it ever, right? Outside of what you pen up, it exists only in your mind. It doesn't count. Does not count. It's like saying, I won the game. Did you play? No, but I imagine that I won. It's in my head that I won. I walked through the steps of winning. I won. You didn't win the game. You didn't actually put it, pin it up or put the ball through, whatever. You didn't win. Does that make sense? Like, it's important. You have to conflate those 2 things. In the real world, it's going to be built, right? That's the thing that matters the most. But if you're not doing that, the representation is the design. So when you get critics who nitpick on like line weights and stuff, and you kind of like, whatever. Like, no, not whatever. That is your design. If you meant to have an opening there and you didn't draw an opening, there's no opening.
And that's where the whole, graphics, you don't have to worry about it in terms of like code and things like that. But the representation is super important because it demonstrates your understanding of space.
Yep.
Which is something that sometimes you can tell a lot of students don't understand it.
Yep. Okay. What else with the critics? I think that's a fair amount of the stuff I had to say, maybe all of it, in fact.
I would say if, there is one critic that caught your attention and you want to, catch up after the review or get their email address or ask them a question, go after them after they're done and try and get a few words. They're probably going to be tired and probably a lot of people are going to try and chat with them, or they might just disappear very quietly and you won't get a chance to talk to them. But if there is something that, you want to know or you feel like you want to keep going the conversation with them, don't be shy and go to them afterwards.
Yeah, because most critics are not assholes in that they want to be there. They've taken time out of their lives to show up, which as a student you don't recognize how big of a sacrifice it is to just leave an office, for an hour, 4 hours or whatever.
And a lot of them are not paid too.
So if you go up to them, they will be super happy, very likely, because they want to be there, they want to help. And speaking as a person who's done plenty of guest critiques, it's kind of a bummer in a way, because if you show up in the middle, because a lot of times you can't be there for the whole, you show up in the middle, there's not a huge introduction, you kind of sneak in, you sit down, you do the stuff, and then you have to kind of like silently wave goodbye and you disappear. It's like, that was kind of
weird.
Not rewarding.
It's weird.
I just sacrificed.
It's weird. So when you have a student who comes to you at the end and, wants to know more about what you said, it's very satisfying for the critics and also for you. I mean, how many times do you get a good critic that you want to have a conversation with after? Not very often. So if you find one, don't let it go. Yeah,
absolutely. The other actually big topic with the critics that I think students have to recognize is the politics between them. Most of the ones I've been a part of, people behave themselves pretty well, but there's definitely places where it's more of a show of people and how much black they can wear and how thick their glasses frames can be than it is anything else. And I suppose that kind of format has some kind of value, but, really in my mind, it's like, just go look at yourself in a mirror, you self-centered.
Again,
whatever.
we should all be in our underwear during reviews. I think that's right.
Yeah. And so you have to recognize that there's pressures that the critics have. When you have 6 people and they're all talking and the dean of the school shows up, things change. If 3 of the professors are tenured, you have one kid in there who's not tenured, but he's trying to be tenured, or someone who's not teaching yet, but he wants to teach there, different dynamics, right? That, these are things you have to be aware of, because it's the same thing when you have a client meeting, you have different people in the meeting. What's the power structure you're dealing with?
You have the structural engineer, mechanical engineer, the client, the landscape guy. They all have an agenda. They all have, they like each other. They've worked with each other in other schools or on other projects in case of a firm, right? There is like pre-existing conditions that you're not aware of that will definitely create a dynamic in the room, right?
Pushing agendas. That's something that definitely a lot of critics, some critics do. They push their agenda, their way of thinking and whatever, because they're using it as a way to validate themselves, which is really pathetic.
Like activists, I don't know, people who are obsessed with homeless shelter, right. Or like gentrification or women in architecture. And they're just like, that's who they are. Right. And they just push that on. Well, once again, I think it's a little selfish.
Yeah.
It's like, well, first look at the other lenses you have to wear and then maybe put that one last because that one is yours and it might not apply to that project or that student. Mm-hmm. So don't just spray it on everyone you meet, Yeah,
again, also not helpful because you're meant to be helping the student understand their process, right? So if a sustainability dude comes in, he's like, well, you talked about all this stuff, but what about the sustainable blah, blah? It's like, well, as a student, I remember always thinking, well, clearly, dude, that's not the realm of this project. I get it's important, for sure.
I'm not dismissing that.
But that it appeared nowhere within what I'm trying to do right now. And the only thing that matters really is that the student came up with an idea. Hopefully it's good, right? And they executed the idea. You didn't include what I'm interested in? Okay, so what? They could include your idea in the next project once they start growing. Right?
Yeah.
So pushing agendas is something to be aware of. Another way to look at it too is I think critics who have their own shtick. They say the same thing over and over and over again, right? Yeah. And then you need to recognize too as a student, like, are they saying it because they're engaged with me, right? Or are they just saying stuff? Actually, the final thing with critics is that Are they good listeners? Right? People, I've been asked, like, okay, what does it mean to teach design? To be good, you have to be a good listener. To be a good critic, to be a good designer, right, for clients, to be a good teacher, you have to be a good listener. That's step one. If you're a student and you feel like the critics are not really engaging with you, it tells you something about the feedback you're about to give, likely.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're out of it because they're thinking while you're talking, right? They're looking at the ceiling and they're thinking. But you can tell as things go on if they're just kind of like hammering their point, or are they going to be open? Are they looking for an exchange? Sorry, go ahead.
No, go for it.
In the same way, are the critics like too excited to be part of the review and talking to each other, right? And I you know, as much as I love being on reviews with like friends and whatever, I cannot stand it when I get to review and there's like all this conversation between the critics and they're joking, making laughs and comments and whatever. It's like, hey, this is so rude. Like this is about the student. The student is like, didn't sleep, clearly. They're trying their best. And you think like funny comments on the side are going to help anyone? Grow up, right?
Yeah.
I know it's a long day, but grow up. You're meant to be helping. You're an adult, right? So as a student, that's something you can be aware of too. And it's
and that's where doing being the presenter is very difficult because it is so much you have to juggle with.
Yeah.
And it takes practice. It really takes practice. So, you know, when I'm like, oh, you should rehearse with your friend or present to your parents your project, it's not just, you know, like the thing that everyone should be doing but no one does. It's really because there's so much practice you're gonna get in school that you gotta find practice elsewhere, right?
You, in reviews and in every situation in the rest of your life, you're gonna be surrounded by people who don't do things how they should
right
be.
Way.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And that's obviously a matter of perspective, but no, it's a matter of logic. And you have to learn how to deal with it. That's also, again, the social dynamics of the review are important for a student to go through. This reminds me, this is kind of different, but I've been in a number of music ensembles, and one of them was a wind orchestra band, right? We're in a room, big room, people playing, and it's a weird thing to get 150 people in one room to be in perfect sync. Like that's when you think about it,
the stars are aligned.
it's kind of like remarkable to have that happen. But, you know, music functions in a kind of amazing way. But anyway, especially when they're like, you know, and all of them are in their 20s and everyone's really focused. But at some point throughout like a 2-hour rehearsal, things start to become unraveled because everyone's tired. And it's not that people were grumpy or upset or sleepy. We were too excited. There's too much laughter and excitement going on. And I remember the director like saying, keep it together, like hold on to it. Like, you know, don't get lazy. I think is maybe like, don't be lazy. Don't get lazy. The same thing happens with critics, even though they're a lot of times 30, 40, 50, they get lazy.
But that's where, to me, the coordinator, meaning the teacher who's in charge of running that day, right, has to not just unlock the door in the morning and lock it in the evening when it's over, and watch the time for like pee breaks and lunches. You know, it's more than that. You're the coach. Like you're the waiting coordinator that day, right? Like you got the list. This is the things that needs to happen. You gotta keep people motivated. You gotta keep people attentive, right? You gotta make sure the light's working, that people are not spending too much time, that everybody has a chance to speak.
Right.
You know, there is a lot for that person that day, and I feel like a lot of teachers gave up a long time ago after maybe their fifth review. They're like, okay, now I'm just gonna chill for today. I'm basically not working. I'm just gonna hear other people talk.
Well, let's get into that because that's the next topic, right? Oh. But the last thing I want to say is, so if you're a student and you see the critics are getting a little loose, especially at the end of the day, the end of the review, and there's too much chit chat between them,
just throw candies at them.
No, and you're about to present and they're still doing stuff. You just stand up there and you just wait. You just be silent and you just look at them. And it's a weird thing. People will fall in line when you're silent and you just look at them.
With big eyes.
Yeah. I had a student one time, but his classmates he was presenting last, final review. You know, things are becoming unglued. And it's tough, too, when you're in a shared space in the school and you can hear all the other people, like, celebrating and stuff. And his classmates were getting a little wild. He looked at me, hey, knock it off. did it humorously, but it worked, and this is what I'm saying. You have to take control of the situation.
So is there anything that you like to say or do as a critic?
Well, the first thing is listen. I always try as hard as possible to listen to the student.
I'm sure it's difficult for you.
Fortunately, I have a lot of practice at listening. All I do is listen. That's why on here I talk a lot, because in the rest of my life, I'm very oppressed.
You want to talk about your issues at home?
It's the only room I have to express myself. Outside of here, I'm not allowed to say anything. Listeners, that's why it is this way.
You have an SOS sign hidden behind me or something?
Yeah. My chain is actually, my foot is actually chained to the desk. So what I like to do is I always ask, not always, but a lot of times I'll ask the student, as soon as they're done talking, I say, can you just repeat what it is you tried to do? And I know...
Oh, you're that guy.
Yeah.
That guy who's like, he didn't listen to anything I just said.
Sometimes that's the case. Sometimes my brain kind of goes off in a different direction.
And then the students repeat, and then you go on about something else that they say, and you're like, okay, so that guy actually listened. It just made me repeat.
No, it's because... well, first of all, it tends to be that the front part of the presentation is the most dense, because that's when we're talking about ideas and stuff, right? And that's the part that is not displayed graphically. Like I can look at the graphics and digest that and talk about that. But the conceptual stuff, there's a blurb that's on the page sometimes not. But that's the stuff that's easy to get lost with. So it's very dense. It's hard for me to digest and listen at the same time. But also, a lot of times, students will say a slightly different version of what they said in the beginning, because what they said in the beginning they either screwed up or they think they didn't say the right thing, so they try to switch it a little bit, so it maybe this time it will get validated. It's when you're conversing with someone like we do on this podcast, it's very rare, or you're having a conversation in general, it's very rare that a person says exactly what they mean and feel the first time and then you're good. Oh, I do. You do, because you're French. People who are much older do, because they've had life experience. They've said the same thing a million times. But, in the case of a student presenting, a good chance they didn't get it right or they meant something different. So I always ask, a lot of times I ask them to repeat, because then I see like, oh, this is actually, if they say something twice, okay, you actually meant it. If they left something out, okay, that's not what you meant. Because the first thing you said was a mess. You had a bunch of stuff that you said, and we could go a million different directions with it. You're not clear, right? So the second time brings clarity for me, even if they don't recognize it. And I like to ask questions about the students. And that's because I'm interested in people also. Oh, no, and so in one case, there's certainly patterns you see among students in terms of like how they're struggling, right? Yeah, for sure. And I was at a review once, and I had this distinct feeling that the project was really bad. And I had a feeling it had to do with the fact that this was a transfer student and they're much older and they weren't loose, right? And I just said, okay, if you don't mind me asking, like, how old are you? He's like, I'm 27, and that's a second year. I'm like, okay. I don't want to typecast all transfer students. That's not the case for all transfer students. But a lot of times they come with certain issues that's different from like a 17-year-old, right? 17, 18-year-olds, they tend to be much looser than a 27-year-old, understandably so. So that's, again, goes back to context. There's a little bit of like investigation that I like to do to know the student. The other thing I think for me as a critic is that you are trying, like earlier we were saying is about honesty and eroding the layers of pretense and whatnot. As a critic, I try to actively do that too. Someone has to do it, right? So what does that mean? Well, again, instead of talking about the product itself, talk about the process. How did you get here? What did you do? Oh, wait, how long did you spend doing this thing, right? Or just asking them how they feel, which is kind of a funny question to ask at a design review. I'm very serious design review. We're wearing all black and we're having very pristine drawings and renderings and stuff. But I think it's a good question. How do you feel about the project? How are you feeling right now? Are you nervous? Get them to relax, because when they're relaxed, you can actually have a deeper connection with them. And that's when they're more honest and truthful. Because I mentioned in a previous recording, students struggling with presentations making a presentation, right? And there's this kind of mystery around it and afraid to ask questions. And one student I had, it was like, I don't know how to, like, I'm struggling. It sucks. I know it sucks. I don't know how. And that was the first step toward them learning something, because there was no pretension. There was no hiding. There's no lying. There's no like trying to make sure I win and look good in front of everyone. The more you can get rid of that stuff during the feedback part of the review, the better. So it's like, do you like what you did?
That's a tough question. This one is it's a tough question.
If I can understand how they feel about the project internally, then I can give really good feedback. If I don't understand how they think about the project, then it's a problem, right?
Right.
Yeah. It's understanding it from their eyes. As I imagine, the same thing as it's the same thing as working with the client. If you can understand how the client thinks and how they perceive things, that's golden. I pay a lot of money to have that written down for me or have that implanted into my brain. The same thing, I think, for me when I'm talking to a student. That's like, these are not always things I say, but it's always kind of underneath. And I'm aware of this because these are a certain base level of understanding for these things in order for there to be productive conversation.
Mm-hmm.
You were going to say?
I was going to say about the whole kind of like, dropping the shoulder and make them relax and kind of open up, instead of being this like super crisp clamshell, I usually try and say something like funny of some sort. I won't venture on like landing an actual joke because you don't know the audience, but like say something kind of like, a little out there, just to make them feel more comfortable. I feel like if you're a critic and the way you present yourself to the student and people is like by like, providing fear or like a little bit of fear or apprehension, it's not a good exchange because there is this kind of notion again of like power dynamic. So to me, it's more like, okay, let's get it with our shoes off, shoes off. It's almost like maybe that's something that should happen during reviews. Like everybody takes their shoes off. You're more comfortable.
Right.
And I think therefore the dialogue is more open. There is less holding back from both sides, right? The critics don't want to, sometimes are scared to upset the students or make them cry or hurt their feelings, so they just like praise, right? And sometimes the students is scared to really say what they think or what they actually try to do because they're afraid that they're not going to satisfy the critics. So by just saying, hey, we're just here to kind of have fun, explore, discuss, debate. It's not... it's not a death penalty that's going to land at the end, right? Like, that's not it. There
are some students who need the whip. They need to be told that they're doing shitty. And you can tell when they're not putting an effort.
They are, and for sure. And that's where you still have to be, being honest doesn't mean like you're nice, right? Yeah. Being honest is just like, I think they would hear your critics and take it maybe more seriously that way than if you are kind of playing that ego and power dynamic.
Yeah, I agree.
Because there is often like rejection and rebellion from that dynamic from the weaker side, and ultimately the message doesn't go through.
I think also there's thinking more as a student, I suppose, why is it that this person got a good review? And first of all, the term good review is misused by many students because it means a review were, they were praised. That doesn't mean a good review. That just means they were praised. Why did were they praised and I wasn't or whatever? And again, it's a kind of a crapshoot. Also, there is this weird thing where the shittiest students get the most praise sometimes. Because we want to encourage them.
But that's just straight lies.
For me, I get that there's a certain amount of positivity that exists within the teaching realm. I am a teacher and I understand that, but there's fairness, right? It's unfair for the student who did no work to get praised and to be, have all the eggs. No, that's not the case. That's rude. It's entirely rude to all the other students. It's unfair. I think if you're a student and this is frustrating you, or you're a student who didn't do any work and you get praised,
you should feel bad about yourself.
Be aware of this. Be aware of this. And the critics who just praise, shame on you. Then you're not helping anybody.
Yeah.
You're not helping anybody. Okay, on to the review structuring itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have some pretty strong statements about how it should go, it seems like.
I don't know. I mean, I've been to a few reviews, right? And I have done a few reviews as a student and
as a critic.
And as a critic. And I could say that a lot of time the teacher that day is completely gone off the picture, I feel like. And
in what way?
Like not actually leading the day in a way. You know, like to me, like I was saying, it's not just, they're not the janitor who's going to come and open the door in the morning and close it when the event is done, right? It's the person who's running the show. There is a timeline. There is things that need to happen, things that shouldn't happen.
Right.
And
Yeah.
coaching. And, you know, it's like, well, you invited 6 strangers today as critics that no one knows where they're from, if they wash their hands, if they have socks on, like, you know, those wild people. And you're just letting them loose in the room all day, you know, like,
And this was my project.
You know, and if your teacher is there, like, no big deal. Well, to me, like, that's not right. So, you know what? You're the teacher, you invited them. Those people are grown up. They're here for something. If you feel like they're lacking interest or they're not doing their job as critics, it is your role to tell them. I know what you're going to say. Yeah. You're going to say, like, oh, school politics, like the teacher is trapped, you can tell them whatever. Okay,
that's not what I was gonna say.
Okay, fine. Sometimes it applies. You can't say anything because guess what? It's the daughter of the dean who's one of your critics, so you can't tell her she can't be on her phone all day. She has to speak, right?
That's not what I was going to say at all. As if I would be the one to be concerned about whatever bosses. No, I'm not concerned about that at all.
So what were you going to say?
I get your points. I think there are aspects of a review. The teacher has to be super control, right? You are the commander. You're the director. You're the leader. Take lead. There's other aspects where don't touch that. It's not your job. So I think one, starting on time is really dependent on the students picking up on time. But, it is rude to start super delayed because of the critics. But after you start, if you say we have X number of minutes for students, that's it. You, as the teacher, you're the moderator. You set a timer. When that timer goes off, you move on to the next thing. You don't allow critics to be going on and on and on. Maybe like 10 seconds to wrap up a thought, fine. But this 20 minutes turns into half an hour. Rude. Rude to the students who get no minutes at the end. Rude to the critics who only get to see 2 projects and not the rest or whatever, right? No. You have very few things to be in charge of, teacher. One of them is to keep time.
Right.
Keep freaking time. It annoys me as a critic, as a student, as a fellow faculty member when teachers don't do this and goes on and on. I'm like, okay, this is an academic thing. You don't do this in the real world, right? Also, when the critic shows up and they're a new critic, you introduce them. It is, again, rudeness is a thing with me. It's rude to invite a person, they take time off, they show up, they sit down, and you don't introduce them to everyone else. You know how awkward it is to show up into a formal review setting, not be introduced, and then have to try and find a seat that maybe or may not be for you?
No.
Right? Oh,
you were invited on a review that didn't care for you.
People do that all the time, though,
Yeah.
and it's like, it's just inconsiderate. Now, how much do the teachers get involved during the review process itself, other than keeping time?
Oh, no.
My view, none.
Yeah, I agree.
All you have to say is the time's up, everyone's seated, okay, begin. Student, you have to introduce yourself. You have to deal with the critics if they're not situated yet, right? If they didn't listen to me. You have to deal with the critics if they give bad feedback. You have to deal with the politics, everything that's there. You deal with it. You're in control. It's your show. It's not my show. Most of all, or least of all, there's been this thing I've seen where teachers jump in during the feedback part.
Oh, no, you can do that.
First of all, should teachers be giving feedback during these reviews? If it's an interim review, like the 4 weeks into the quarter semester. So it's not a mid-year, not final. Fine. Some feedback. Fine. But if it's a mid-year final, no, I'm not saying anything as a teacher. Not my job. Actually, I think it's rude, again, to invite people, take time off, come in, and now I'm going to preach for 10 minutes about something.
Yeah,
it's
guess
like,
what?
do this with your students. You see your students like 10, 15 hours a week. Do it then, not when I'm here sitting, taking time out of my day. So I disagree with that. Also, it disrupts the dynamic of the student having to be the one to take control. They need the pressure. They need to learn what it means to be in that position. I've also seen on the extreme, during the question and answer process, critics points out a problem or says something, whatever, students trying to say something, teacher jumps in and says, well, let me explain for the student what he tried to do. Let me defend the student. I feel like my hair fell out of my face, like melted when I saw that. And I've seen it a couple of times. Like, what are you doing? Who are you? This is the worst thing you can do at a review. Is to step in as a teacher, if you're a teacher, step in and start defending the student and presenting for the student. What is this? You're not presenting. Is it because you're afraid that you don't want to look bad as a teacher because you want to be rehired? Okay, that is self-centered. It's a different issue. Don't bring that stuff into the studio. You should give a shit less whether you get hired. Focus on the student.
Yeah, and again, by doing that, you are not helping the student. It's detrimental to the presenter.
Really grosses me out
because it basically says that they can't speak for themselves, they can't defend themselves, like they need your help, and that's just. Here's
the thing. You're either prioritizing yourself and how you look as a teacher,
selfish,
or you're prioritizing a conversation about the work but not the student, also not selfish. Good. So what is your reason for doing this? It is to be honest, if I were a student and my teacher was doing this, I would probably tell the teacher, next time, just let me handle it on my own, even if I fail.
Right.
You got to let them screw up. You got to let them feel what it's like to screw up and to handle themselves when things aren't going wrong. Because things don't go right, but the vast majority of the time outside of an academic setting. You can't build a cast for them and expect them to be able to walk later on. It doesn't work. I like that.
Why you paint the professional world in such a dark color?
It's just the reality of things, and it's not just about.
It's tough. It's not like
And it's not just about the profession and the practice. It's you're out conversing with people and just reality, trying to decide if we're gonna go for food and stuff.
It's just rude because again, the schooling process is about growth. And by doing that, you're just stopping their growth right there. You're just cutting the roots under their feet.
So letting the students take care of themselves, that is my position on it. And I think a lot of teachers don't do this. So some good number do, I feel, but maybe less. And I think some critics are like kind of shocked by this. It's like, is the teacher going to contribute or say anything? It's like, no, I see these kids like 15 hours a week. I don't need to talk to them some more. And that's not the lesson, right? This is the lesson that's happening right now. And they need to sink or swim. They have to figure it out. And then I think as a teacher, you should probably have a recap at the end with all the students. And you need to find a balance between, saying some positive things so people feel inspired to move on, but not lying.
And you know what? I think
if it was bad, it was bad.
I think the review, like the next day or so with the individual students to kind of like debrief is great. I think the recap at the end of the actual day is a very good point. Mm-hmm. And to that, I would also ask the students, what did you guys think of the critics?
Yep.
Because guess what? Critics are also going to be criticized, right?
Yeah,
if someone was really bad and all of the student thinks that they didn't give anything good, well, it's good for you to know, because there's no point of having someone like that coming back to other reviews if that's what they're going to provide as a critic.
That's
Somebody
true.
was great, and maybe the students are even interested in having them on a desk crit or something else. Like you have to check in with your students. You have to know, like, are you satisfied with the critics you got today? Are you not? Why?
I think that's really important because you're putting the pressure on the students to say something. It goes back to being a good listener as a critic, right? I think critics and teachers spend so much time, they think their job is to talk and to teach. And we think that teaching and helping someone as a critic is to spew out information. Well, of course, that's partially true. You need to say something. But that's maybe half of it, actually, in reality. It's definitely not more than 50% of it. The real trick is to get them to engage the student.
And I think that's why it's particularly important to have those kinds of recap and reviews in the first few years of the 5 years, because they need to feel comfortable. They need to, like you said, to be able to open up, to be critical, to have a voice. That happening in 5th year, well, it's different because then, they should be developed, right? Yeah. But it's like raising kids, right? Like you're raising kids to be grown up and tough into the world, like once they leave the school and fly on their own and whatever. So I think those things are important.
I think also another reason why contributing as a teacher during the feedback session is not a good idea is because it's almost like you're what is it? You're messing with the water. Like the I don't know, like the water wants to be what it's going to be, right? And that's the point of it. But you're tampering with it too much. You're coloring it with what you want it to be, right? The other thing too, you were saying ask students what they thought to get their feedback about the critics. True. I have to say that my ideal critic lineup is to have for every student at least one critic who's really terrible.
No, I mean, I think
I'm dead serious, and it's not a gimmicky thing. I'm not saying it because it sounds cool or because of, it is about life lessons, but I don't want, not life lessons. It needs to be there. You need that grain of sand.
But you need to know who is terrible. You can't have a lineup of 5 terrible and a good one.
Sure.
Right. But if that guy's terrible, I'm going to pair him with these other people.
Yeah. Yeah, there could be a good mix. Yeah. I mean, there's some kind of team of critics that's ideal for the student to learn more about themselves, the student to learn more about technique, the student learn more about design in the building, and the student learning how to manage people.
And I think that's why like you were saying, sometimes you get critics because people are canceled, or you have to have them, or like different situation, right? But in the ideal situation where you can pick the critics that you can have on, I think kind of portraying those different types of people as your array of critics that day is the best for the students, for the types of discussion that can happen, right? If you invite like 5 sociologists, you know what it's going to be about that day, right? Yeah. So, the more mix, the merrier. And
I like to invite people also who are not in architecture sometimes, the kind of the wild card for that reason. And I also I will send the critics like the brief of the project beforehand. A lot of times they don't read it because they're too busy. I get it, right? And also teachers, if you're going to invite critics, don't send like a 5-page thing. Like I don't have time to read. They show up, and at the very beginning of the review, before the review starts, sometimes I will give an introduction to the course if it's really kind of complicated what's happening. Other times I'll let the first student do that. And if you're the first presenter, it's your job. You have the added responsibility of doing this. If a new critic shows up and you're like the second to last presenter, it's your job to introduce them to the project, right? But anyway, so I will have critics, they ask me, were they allowed to do this? Ask the student. Because you will learn that you can actually affect the outcome of the review, both in terms of the quality of the feedback you get, how much you learn, and whether or not you win or convince people by your ability to manage them. Yeah. Right? That's the biggest thing, the biggest part of the review, I feel. So when they turn and ask me something, right back, ask the student. And the student says something, and they go off and whatever. And when I meet with the student afterwards, I say, how did you think it went? Well, I didn't like this or that. I say, it happened because you said this and it threw them off, right? You should have said this instead. Oh, okay, right. And I will say, it's actually really difficult to sit and not say anything.
Take notes, write down, write things down.
No. I mean, it's difficult because you care for the students and you want so badly. It's like, you should have just said that one thing. I know, you're like
the Papa Bear, but...
You can't. You got to let them do their thing. You can't be the helicopter parent.
Yeah.
That's what it is. You can't do that. Also, at the end of review, actually, it's a good idea to ask the critics, do you have any last comments before we wrap it up? Or heck, you could even do that before, one of them leaves. Dan is about to leave. Dan, do you have anything you want to say to the class before you leave? Because usually the critics, especially ones that are there for all 12 to 20 students now, they've been thinking about stuff. And at the end, they have some comments about the class or the body of students or whatever that could be just as important and as educational as the review itself. So the critic should always have an opportunity to say something. It's kind of a bummer when you're a critic and you don't have that chance, because it's like, got a bunch of stuff to say. I guess I'll just eat half a sandwich and leave. Oh, the sandwiches are gone now too. Oh, okay. Do you remember reviews with fond memories, or were you what was your attitude as a?
Like I was telling you, I think in France we didn't have outside critics during our reviews. We're just reviewing to, I think, either our teachers or our teachers and another teacher. I can't remember. No, I mean, my take on it was just do my part, get control of all the things I can control, and the rest it's gonna be fine.
Yeah.
And learn not to take it personally.
That's true. There are some people, though, that need to take it personally because they have an attitude problem. An attitude is, a hairline away from being a significant part of the design process. I think also, I remember being a presenter, and you can feel because you've seen the critics do feedback already. You're like, this is a dud. This is a bad batch. Well, don't shut down. Still use it as an opportunity to pitch out your ideas and say new things, because you're always improving on the previous presentation anyway.
That, and you can also ask them questions if they can come up with the stuff you want. Be like, well, I did that. What do you guys think? Or how do you feel about, just try and shake them up a bit.
Yeah. I don't know if we missed anything. It's been quite a while since all this for us, in a sense.
It's been a while.
COVID has changed things, so it's like, I'm trying to remember the last time I was at a physical review. But if we missed anything, then feel free to reach out.
The hotline, 213-222-6950. You can call and leave a voicemail. You can shoot a text message, and we usually try to respond to them. Sometimes it takes us a while, but we really try to do. If
you're listening to this, subscribe. iTunes, Spotify, subscribe on YouTube if you watch us on YouTube. Also, support us by leaving us a review in the podcast app, the Apple Podcast app, or leaving a comment down in the YouTube section. We see those. And again, anything we missed, you can drop a comment there. You can
social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And actually, if you're on Instagram and you do follow us and you don't want to miss any of our posts, you can just tap on the little 3 dots on the corner right of any of our posts and turn on notifications. So anytime we post something, you get a little alert.
Yep, definitely. Apart from that, this is the second studio now. What else do we have going on? It's more interviews happening, exciting things.
The new website is up.
The new website is up. You can check it out. It's fully functional. Fully operational.
It's fully functional. Hopefully it's clearer. You have some transcripts of some of our interviews out there, clips, and why not. So, stay tuned. A lot of good stuff coming up.
All right. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again next week or sooner. Bye.
Ciao.